Hearing losses are the symptom of damage to the ear and can have many different causes and be experienced different from person to person. I would like to present to you the far most common one, age-induced hearing loss. Let me introduce to you Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown is in his late 60s and has recently experienced it getting harder and harder to understand what people are saying. Mrs. Brown, his significant other, noticed the signs 6 or 7 years ago when he first started turning the TV up. Even though Mr. Brown is still convinced that it's just wax blocking his ears and that younger people today are mumbling when they talk, he reluctantly accepts Mrs. Brown's suggestion that they see an ear, nose and throat doctor, an ENT, to get a hearing test. So, even though Mr. Brown hopes there is nothing wrong with his ears, later that month, Mr. and Mrs. Brown head to the clinic for an appointment with the ear, nose and throat doctor. The ENT doctor is a specialist in hearing, so he starts by looking into Mr. Brown's ears and asking him lots of questions about his general health, his ears, and his working life before retirement. He also tests Mr. Brown's hearing in several ways and concludes that he is experiencing age-induced hearing loss. He explains that it's quite normal. The inner ear is not working so well as it did when he was younger and suggests Mr. Brown gets a hearing aid. Mr. and Mrs. Brown head back home after the appointment. Mr. Brown wants to sleep on it. He has so many thoughts and the news is a bit of a shock to him. But Mrs. Brown would rather like to meet with a hearing care professional as soon as possible. That night, Mr. Brown keeps thinking, aren't they really expensive? Can I get used to wearing those devices? And he can't help thinking about his own father, who was never happy with his hearing aid back in the 80s. Mr. Brown contacts the hearing aid clinic and makes an appointment in 2 weeks' time. In their country, that's the way to get hearing aids, but in other countries you could go to a public hearing aid provider. The day finally arrives, and Mr. Brown is still feeling very nervous, but takes himself to the hearing aid clinic. There, he meets his local hearing care professional, who asks more questions to be able to recommend the best solution for Mr. Brown. Questions about his ears, his hearing loss, and where he finds hearing challenging. She also looks at the audiogram from the ENT and once again measures the hearing loss to find out what type of hearing aid is needed. She asks Mr. Brown's preference and she shows him some hearing aids in different sizes. Some that go behind or in the ear and some that are custom made in the shape of the ear. Mr. Brown finds it difficult to choose with so many options and would like a recommendation from the hearing care professional. She helps Mr. Brown choose a device that can be fitted right away. She explains that with the knowledge she has about his hearing loss and listening goals, she will fit the device to be just right for him. The hearing care professional puts the hearing aids on the ears of Mr. Brown and connects the devices to the PC to program them. After she has fitted the devices, she makes a short test to make sure Mr. Brown actually likes the sound. "Wow, it's really loud," he says. The hearing care professional explains that it just sounds loud because he has become used to having a hearing loss and his hearing sounds again he's not heard for some years. "You will get used to it," she explains, and gives Mr. Brown's instructions on how to wear it. She then invites him to come back in 2 weeks' time for a follow-up. Mrs. Brown can already notice Mr. Brown hearing better and agrees to the next appointment. When they leave the clinic, Mr. Brown has a bag with the devices and some leaflets explaining how to get started using the hearing aids. On the way home, Mr. Brown can hear so much around him. The world is a busy place again. He can even hear the wind rustling the leaves in the trees. Even though he's hearing more, he can't help thinking about the other things he would have used the money on. Some home improvements, or a long holiday in the sun. But Mrs. Brown is happy Mr. Brown is hearing better, and says that was money well spent. Over the following weeks, Mr. Brown tries his new hearing aids in lots of different places. He sometimes finds it very difficult. Easy to put them on, but the sound is so loud and busy. There are so many sounds he hasn't heard for a long time. The crunch of the newspaper, the chatter of children, and the noise of the traffic. And he almost gives up. But it's not all difficult. He can hear the birds singing, conversations are getting easier, Mrs. Brown's voice is clearer, and after 2 weeks he suddenly notices he's been watching TV at a much lower volume. Sometimes he almost forgets that he's wearing his hearing aids. On the day of the follow-up appointment, Mr. Brown is back at the clinic. The hearing care professional asks Mr. Brown more questions to find out how he's getting on with his hearing aids. He explains what he's been hearing, and sometimes it's still very loud. So the hearing care professional then fine-tunes the hearing aids with the PC and offers an additional setting he can use in noisy situations. "It sounds much better now," says Mr. Brown.